What we have on our agenda today is go through the second interim. And with that, we'll also have some discussions, as noted on the agenda, of where we see things landing for 24-25 versus 25-26. And with that, we will ask Director Akala to kind of walk us through the second interim. And that'll also include a little bit of our multi-year projection, where we'll start looking at the next 2 years. And one key thing I want everybody to keep in mind is at second interim, when we do our multi-year projection, we're projecting for the current year and the next 2 years. But remember, in our let's say our mental math, for as an example, we're already thinking about the June budget adoption. And when we adopt that budget in June, or present a budget to the board, whatever the third year is in our multi-year projection becomes our second year at budget adoption. So the current year falls off and we add 1 year to the end. So think about that as we go through that process, if that makes sense. Director Akala, I will turn it to you at this point to go through the second interim. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Superintendent Kamick. Hey, everyone. So I'm just going to go over the second interim, similar to what we did at the board meeting. Just a reminder, second interim, if you could go to slide 2 real quick, Patty. There we go. Yep. Yeah, just a reminder, second interim covers our bases between July 1 through January 31st. So we're at that midpoint of the fiscal year. So it's all the transactions that has occurred between that timeline. Next slide, please. So starting at a high level, these are the key points to remember for today's presentation. Vacancies are the major highlight of second interim. Being at the halfway point, we're able to make tighter projections for reducing expenditures based on vacancies that will go unfilled, especially in our special education program, where we reduced about $8 million to the contribution, mainly because of the vacancies. And because of the expenditure reductions due to vacancies, our current unrestricted budget is going from a $2 million deficit at first interim to a $7 million surplus, which is increasing the ending fund balance. However, deficit spending balloons again in 24-25 and 25-26 to $17 million and $26 million as we look to the multi-year projections. As a result, the ending balance decreases from $67 to $50 to $23 million by year 3. So right-sizing the district to enrollment will need to start next fiscal year. Plus a budget solutions plan will be necessary to support a balanced budget in the future. Next slide, please. So here's a visual for the relationship between our structural deficit and our ending balance. So the green bar shows our ending balance for Fund 1 plus Fund 17, which is similar to like a savings account. The blue bar shows the surplus in the current year, and the red bar shows unrestricted deficit spending in the out years. You can see that as deficit spending grows, it drains our ending balance. Our goal is to eliminate that red bar we see by making budget reductions. Currently, the district's fiscal operations are akin to paying a mortgage with a savings account. These one-time dollars are eventually going to run out. So as discussed, the county does review our fiscal condition within 3-year increments, and they're watching us pretty closely. So we're under the microscope, and adopted budget is right around the corner, just like Superintendent Kamick said. So let's extend this scenario to 1 more year. Next slide, please. So by extending the chart, we can see that our ending balance will be depleted by 26-27. This multi-year scenario includes vacancy reductions and closing positions as one-time funding expires. A raise is not included in this picture. So in order to sustain a 4% reserves by 26-27, we're projecting currently that we'll need $14 million starting next year in cuts. The good news is that the board and leadership, they have made prudent decisions that has provided us with a healthy ending fund balance in the current year. Now that gives us extra runway to balance the budget by making reductions starting next year. Now, if you read the news headlines, there are districts all over California that are making massive cuts in the month of March, but our ending balance is protecting the programs in 23-24. So that healthy balance is protecting our programs in the current year. Now, the 3 major reasons for the structural deficit includes, number 1, declining funded ADA, number 2, COLA reductions, which both lead to lower revenues, and finally 3, expenditures outpacing revenues. So next slide, please. So you go to the next slide. These are our revenue factors for funded ADA. So funded average daily attendance, it's based on a 3 prior year average of our actual attendance. So we could see funded ADA decreases at a steeper rate in 24-25, now that the average does not include the pandemic years when ADA was frozen. It was frozen at about 34,000 ADA. So as a result, our funded ADA drops 1,000 next year, which negatively impacts our revenues. So please note, during the pandemic, we were not allowed to lay off any classified staff in 2021. That's when we were operating at 34,000 kids, but now we're operating below 31,000 kids. But we still have the similar number of classified staff currently on the books. So aligning staffing to enrollment is unavoidable in the future. Next slide, please. Second, we have COLA coming back down to earth from the highs of 22-23. A 2 to 3% COLA is pretty normal for a traditional year. However, in 24-25, we're dropping down to 0.76%. This lower COLA and declining funded ADA decreases revenues by $7.1 million in 24-25. Next slide, please. Finally, we see the orange expenditures line outpacing the blue revenues line. We need to close this gap. Revenues are coming down while expenditures are continuing to climb. Increasing expenditures are due to stepping column, negotiated raises, special ed contracts, utility costs, PERS increases, and our level of classified staffing. We haven't adjusted classified staff since before the pandemic, but have been steadily decreasing certificated as enrollment declines. So we'll need to make adjustments for both classified and certificated moving forward. Next slide, please. Now that we have the big picture for today's presentation, now let's start drilling down on the current year's unrestricted general fund and work our way to the multi-year projections. So as we got to the mid-year point, like I said before, we are able to better identify vacancies that will go unfilled for the rest of the year. As a result, we decreased expenditure accounts that were budgeted for these vacant positions. The largest impact was in special ed, and the vacancies reductions resulted in us lowering that contribution by $8 million, which helped our operations transition from a $2 million deficit to a $7 million surplus at second interim. Next slide, please. And so the surplus added to our ending fund balance, bringing the total to $51 million. Now, this is good news because we're going to need those one-time dollars to help us remain solvent in the subsequent years due to our structural deficit. Now, $44 million has been committed to deficit spending in 24-25 and 25-26, and then another $5.8 million has been assigned for deficit spending in 26-27. Good news is that the 3% reserves in Fund 17, it remains untouched. The next slide, please. Now, switching over to the restricted side of the house, this is like our categorical one-time dollars and restricted dollars. We've reduced unspent portions of our large multi-year grants to the restricted ending balance. That way, these dollars can be carried over to the 24-25 year in order to implement our future plans. These are multi-year grants, so we need money to carry over for multi-year planning. Now, the bottom line shows that we're continuing planned deficit spending to draw down and spend down these large grants. Next slide, please. Now, some of these large grants that we're spending down includes the Learning and Recovery Block Grant, which we got due to the pandemic, and then the Discretionary Block Grant, which does expire in the next few years. Next slide, please. Now, these are the fund balance designations. We have non-spendables like revolving cash totaling to about $1.5 million. Restricted categorical programs, we have $30 million in the ending balance. This is like the Learning Recovery Block Grant. And we committed $44 million for deficit spending in the 2 future years and assigned $5.8 million total for election costs, LCAP carryover, and deficit spending in 26-27. Next slide, please. Now, our revenue assumptions stayed relatively flat at second interim, and the largest adjustment occurred under state revenues on the right side of the table. You can see there that revenue projections for our ELOP after-school program came in lower by $1 million per CDE. However, we still have a lot of ample funds to continue running this program. We have $10 million this year, and another $9 million in carryover. So we still could run a very robust ELOT program. Next slide, please. Now, oh, sorry, one more above that. There we go. Yep. The major highlight for expenditures occurred on the right side of the table, which is our restricted funding. We saw an increase in certificated salaries to implement that Prop 28 arts and music funding. So that money went out to the sites and we're starting to spend those dollars. We also saw a decrease in expenditures for classified salaries as we determined numerous special ed positions would go unfilled. And please note that the special ed vacancies, they do lead to increasing contract costs as we are still required to provide those services. Some of those certain services include like bus drivers, paras. That's why we also saw our service contracts increase at second interim. That was for the special ed vacancies. Next slide, please. Now for the major part of our discussion, the multi-year projections. So starting with our unrestricted multi-year projections, the very bottom line, it shows that deficit spending is expected to balloon from a $7 million surplus to a $17 million deficit, then a $26 million deficit the next few years. And this is due to diminishing revenues, which is resulting from the declining ADA, lower COLA, and we also see expenditures outpacing revenues as we assume a 1.5% step and column and rising costs to PERS, special education, utilities, etc. Next slide, please. Now, starting at the first red arrow of our multi-year projections, unrestricted ending balance, we see deficit spending depleting our $44 million of committed funds by 25-26. Now that leaves us with $6 million in assigned funds for deficit spending in 26-27. So you can see we're starting to spend down a lot of that ending fund balance. The good news is that we're able to maintain 3% reserves in our Fund 17 in the current and 2 subsequent years. So Fund 17 remains untouched. Now the bad news is that our ending balance for Fund 1 and 17, they do rapidly decrease from 12% to 9% to 4% in the upcoming years. So we're slowly coming down and the future may have to impact Fund 17. Now we do have the runway to derail this, but we have to start aligning our staffing to enrollment next year, 24-25. Next slide, please. So this is our restricted MYP, and it shows planned deficit spending as we go from $36 million to $19 to $2 million in order to deplete our large block grants. And these funds in the restricted ending balance include the Learning Recovery Block Grant and the Discretionary Block Grant. Those are very large grants that we're trying to spend down. Next slide, please. And you can see here that by 25-26, those large one-time grants in the restricted ending balance, they're expected to be spent down by from 30 to 11 to $9 million. So that's planned deficit spending to spend down the large grants. The next slide, please. So these are the major revenue assumptions for MYP. Now, the major update is that COLA is projected at 0.76% in 24-25, but due to the state tax revenues coming in lower than projected, there is uncertainty that the state will actually fund the 24-25 COLA. Not funding COLA is a possible solution presented by the Legislative Analyst Office. So we'll hear more about that from the state and what they decide to do at the May revise, and we'll make sure to update the board and the community as news unravels. Next slide. Actually, one more above that. There we go. Yeah, thank you. Now for our key expenditure assumptions, we have not included any unrestricted classified staffing adjustments. However, by assuming the amount of vacancy budget reductions in the out years, we're able to sustain that 3% reserves. This is also assuming that we're closing positions funded by restricted one-time funding as those dollars expire. And we'll go more into that the next slide. Next slide, please. There we go. Thank you. Now, these are the one-time funds that are set to expire at the end of each of these fiscal years. One-time funds are traditionally given to serve a temporary purpose, such as the Learning Recovery Block Grant. That was allocated to support academic learning due to the pandemic. Now, at the time, districts, we were injected with a lot of one-time COVID funding to sustain our operations, but now those dollars are coming to an end. So based on industry standards that we're following for multi-year projections, we are assuming in our model that positions funded by one-time dollars will be closed as the resources expire. The assumption is that the position ends once the funding ends, because theoretically the purpose is served. Now, if we believe there is good return on investment for our students, we can continue funding a categorical program with other ongoing resources like LCFF, but as long as we can afford it. So the key for us to decipher include like what are our core programs, what's legally required versus what's our second and third tier priorities. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what can we afford as a district? Next slide, please. Now, these are the positions funded by one-time dollars that are scheduled to end in 24-25. Now, please note, I did mention this at the board meeting, that the board is not directing us to close these positions. We, the district, are just following industry standards, and we've assumed in our multi-year projections model that these positions are scheduled to close once the funding expires. Now, the county requires us to itemize our assumptions and submit an itemized list detailing the assumptions that support our numbers. So to be clear, it's not a plan of record, but more of an accounting exercise to balance revenues and expenditures once resources expire. Now, an official budget reduction plan will be finalized at a later time after the board discusses and confirms possible solutions. So as a fair warning, now bringing back any of these positions to the unrestricted general fund will exacerbate our structural deficit. Consequently, if we decide to continue funding any of these positions, then we'll have to make corresponding budget cuts to programs or staffing or find alternative funding sources. Now, the through line that echoes across all of our financial reports that we've been bringing to the board is that we can do anything, but we cannot do everything. So there'll be tough choices ahead. Next slide, please. Now, the main takeaway is that we are solvent for the current and 2 subsequent years, but our ending balance is dwindling fast due to deficit spending. Now, projections show our ending balance for Fund 1 and 17 will be depleted by 26-27, and that's without assuming any negotiated settlements or major unrestricted budget reductions in the upcoming years. So we're going to be faced with tough decisions in the near future, but have the runway to sustain solvency if we start making budget reductions next fiscal year in 24-25. Next slide, please. Now, good news for all the other funds, they are all projected to end the year balanced and without any contributions for the general fund, so they're all self-sustainable. Next slide, please. And finally, for next steps, we'll hear more from the governor and give more information to the board and community on the May revise. And then we'll have the adopted budget for 24-25 in June. And then finally in July, we'll have the 45-day budget update for 24-25. Thank you, everybody, and I'll return it back to Superintendent Camp.
Thanks, James. So a couple just notations before we open it up for discussion. I think Director Akala's note is pretty important. We had a lot of engagement in board discussion in our last board meeting on the second interim. And the board members really, I think, accurately so expressed concern about the second interim resulting in a comprehensive budget reduction plan. And I think Director Akala highlighted that the second interim in and of itself is not a budget reduction tool per se. And what I mean by that is the approval of the second interim, which was passed by the board, doesn't mean that staff moves forward and issues layoff notices or starts to negotiate the effects of reductions. But as Director Akala pointed out, it does note that we need to have a comprehensive budget reduction solution in the near future. And that is where we have to weigh all of our options about what positions we want to keep, how we want to adjust funding. If we want to keep certain things, we'll have to remove other things. And that's all part of a comprehensive budget reduction plan, which unfortunately school districts across the state, including Fremont, have done too many times based on the volatility of our funding. The other important note for those who are following our budget development closely, I would certainly encourage you to join us on April 17th. The board in the last meeting asked for kind of a deeper dive and study session of our budget, and staff is going to present a deeper dive into our budget discussion and budget development on April 17th. So what we're trying to do for that meeting is keep most of the other items off that meeting so that we can really have designated time for a deeper conversation and review of our current budget, our projections for the next school year, and how we're building the current budget. I think as Director Akala pointed out, you have probably seen in headlines across the Bay and across the state a number of districts that at January, February, and early March, based on the governor's budget proposal, started launching into significant budget reduction programs right away. And we have, I think, been fiscally prudent, and we do have enough to maintain our personnel and our programs for one more school year. But it is the 25-26 school year where we're going to need to put into effect reductions, which means those decisions need to start coming next year. So we don't want to look at programs and people first, but we also have to recognize that 85% of our budget is people. And if we're talking about people, that means programs. So, realistically, we know we're going to be having some difficult conversations in the future around budget reductions. I think it was shared in the board meeting that, we need to target a number of somewhere around $30 million as a realistic projection. Now, Director Akala mentioned the COLA and mixed perspectives at the state level about whether or not that should be funded, even at 0.76. What I do want to share before we open it up for discussion is you may have seen, you may not have seen, and it's okay if you haven't, that there was a state level announcement that an early budget deal was reached. Mm-hmm. And, that's not necessarily a budget deal that the state budget is finalized, but the governor and the Senate President Pro Tem Mike McGuire, along with the Assembly Speaker Robert Rivas, did make an announcement last week for an early action deal on the budget. They've identified those solutions to be worth about $12 to $18 billion. And so the way I think about that is, if originally, let's say the budget deficit or problem at the state level was anywhere from 38 to 53 billion, they're looking at these early actions to bring that number down. So for lack of a better term, they're now trying to solve for a smaller deficit. There wasn't a lot that was in K through 14 funding. And remember, when we say K through 14, we're talking about our education system plus community colleges. The key areas of reduction for K-14 were the governor's proposal to reduce the school facilities program by $500 million, and also to approve the governor's proposal to delay $550 million from the California Preschool, Transitional Kindergarten, and Full Day Kindergarten Facilities Grant Program. Now, the bad news is that means a delay for facilities money. The good news, if there is any in that, is that those reductions come outside of Prop 98. And our, kind of primary lens of focus is the Prop 98 funding that we get from the state level. So we'll see how much this influences the total discussion and decision-making at the state level for the state budget, which we'll learn about at the May revise for the governor's revised proposal. And then ultimately, we'll learn what the state budget is in the beginning of June, and we'll know the state budget hopefully by the end of June. But I wanted to just share that state level announcement that was made, because I think it is worth noting, but doesn't necessarily set anything in finality for what we see in June. The way I described it to those that I tried to update on it is, I don't think our budget projections or picture gets any better. But what I do think the state is trying to signify is that they're trying to not make it worse. So we can continue to anticipate that they'll look at the budget stabilization fund that exists at the state level, which didn't exist in the 2008 recession, and likely try and minimize the net impact. But I wouldn't look at anything coming from the state as budget projections getting better. I would look at it as they probably aren't getting worse yet. Which sounds nice, but when the budget projections are as rough as they are, it still gives us a really difficult landscape ahead. So with that, I'll open it up to our advisory task force for questions, input, concerns, thoughts, or reactions on some of those topics. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, James, for that. The slides that I saw, it appears that those are the same slides that were at the last board meeting, yes? And with that, one of the slides, I believe is slide number 23, where you show the elimination of certain job classifications due to funding going out. Some of it looks like it's the parcel tax and some of the other things. Number one, having something like that, I can't tell you how many calls I got and messages I got, because it kind of came as a surprise. It wasn't in the board agenda when we got the release on it. But with that, I don't recall the campus supervisors being part of the parcel tax. I thought the parcel tax was more the we centered more on the LMTs on that, and keeping the library open. They actually added the campus supervisors in that?
Well, let me address a couple parts of that, Michelle, and then I'll defer to the budget team for some of the technical answers. So the same information was included in the first interim, and it was also noted in budget adoption in June. And I apologize that there was cause for concern on that. I certainly understand why there was. In terms of one other notation that I want to make that was made in the presentation, and that is that in the Measure I dollars, I think the primary source of Measure I revenue that is then expended, and the general fund contributes to that because Measure I doesn't pay for all of it, is LMTs, campus supervisors, and prep specialists at the elementary level. One notation, because people may wonder, well, why weren't prep specialists on there? And I think I described it in the meeting, but I would want to highlight it again here. Our prep specialists are really a factor of our existing FUTA contract. So if I'm, for example, teacher, under the contract, I'm provided a prep period each day. And that means that I'm not with my students. I'm doing other professional obligations to prepare for my teaching or engage with parents in the community or prep work for instruction. So during that time, my students have to be with another certificated staff member. And those are the prep specialists. And so we know by default that prep specialists have to go all the way back into the general fund absent a future parcel tax extension. So Michelle, to the other component of your question, Measure I funding campus supervisors, I believe that's been the case for a number of years. Director Akala or Mr. Hillman, do you have more insight on that?
No, you're right. It's been part of the funding ever since I've been here, working with the Measure I committee. It's those three layers. You have your science prep teachers, you have your campus soups, and your library media techs. That's been part of the Measure I parcel tax. You know, we definitely want to make sure that we are as transparent as possible. And I know it sounds like some folks missed it in our book, our adopted budget book, and all of our interim books. We try to make sure it's as legible, readable as possible. In the book, there's like a multi-year projections assumptions section around page 50-ish. It lays out, since adopted budget, our plans around one-time funding and the assumption that, you know, positions close as the funding ends, and we kind of list it all out there. So I'm sorry if it was missed and it caused any issues on your part, Michelle.
Okay. Another question, what I'm not seeing it is, what is our projection for attrition? You know, we hear that, I mean, there's a lot of rumors going around that a lot of people held on for this year because of the 8%, but then they're like, okay, I'm out of here. It's 0.7. So what are our projections there?
Yeah, that's a good question, Michelle. I wish we had an accurate number to share with you there. We really don't. You know, we have seen some retirements come in. I think people who are more certain that they're going to retire because of what you described are letting us know, but it will be hard to know in the end what total difference we'll see year over year. I mean, we're such a big district. We normally have so much staff turnover. to begin with, some for retirement, some for a variety of reasons. What I've heard anecdotally from other districts is that they are not seeing the same level of attrition that they thought they might. And that may just be because of the overall economy and inflation. People may not think that they're all the way ready to retire. But certainly that is something that we're monitoring from the HR perspective. The tough part about the projection for that is people don't have to let us know early. And so we won't really know until we get closer to the end of the year. But that's one of the questions that we would put into the crystal ball machine if we had one.
Okay.
And if I may, coincidentally, we work very closely, the budget office and the HR office. And this morning I had a meeting with Director Khan and I had the same exact question, because my assumption is that people are going to retire. So one of the questions we posed to him was, how's the retirements looking? And he said it's a lot less than he thought it would be. So just like Superintendent Kamek was saying, there's less retirements that we are seeing currently, but it doesn't mean that that's the end of all the retirements. They just have to submit documentation that they're going to retire. So there's a call out for folks. If you're going to retire, submit the documentation soon so we know what the projections are going to look like.
And we know so many people in education do just hero level work every day. And oftentimes a large group of those people don't want any fanfare when it's time for them to retire. So they'll hold on to that notice till the end. So definitely something that could change rapidly in the next few months. Thank you, Michelle, for the questions. Trustee Jones.
Yeah, I think staff has heard my concerns at the board meeting, and I don't really want to repeat all of that here. I think if anybody's interested, they can just watch the recording of the second interim presentation. But I do want to repeat a couple of things. As I'm watching what's happening in other districts and watching San Ramon Valley, I think, cut 50 positions for next school year at a recent board meeting, we're seeing districts making staffing reductions that are effective in the next school year. And our staff has been diligent in helping us avoid that. And I think, I feel grateful and lucky that we are not making staffing reductions for the next fiscal year, like so many of our districts in the state are already doing. I did share, again, my concerns, Michelle. I shared a lot of the same concerns as what you have shared about the information on that slide 23. One of the concerns, and I don't know if there's an answer yet, but one of the issues that I raised, when you look at 29.4 FTE from our LMTs, the library media technicians, that represents every LMT in the elementary and junior high level. That's all of the LMTs in those areas. And my concern with eliminating those positions as being tied to the parcel tax is that we had LMTs before we had the parcel tax. The parcel tax was never meant to fund every single one of those positions. It was meant to augment. So I'm still not clear why we would have tied every single LMT to Measure I funds. And it seems to me like there should be the floor of the LMTs where they were prior to the parcel tax that should have been continued to be funded by the general fund. And I'm just wondering how all of those positions got tied to Measure I.
Great question, Trustee Jones. And I don't have a definitive answer for you. We'd have to do some more historical analysis to see how much of those allocations change year over year since the implementation of Measure I. I can tell you that from my general perspective, in other districts, a similar scope creep, for lack of a better term, has happened because the original revenue identified under a measure, let's say to pay for just X, Y, and Z as variables, when those cost increases happen year over year, that's why we make a general fund contribution to those things. Measure I doesn't cover all of the positions that we fund. And so I have to go back, and staff has been really focused on a few other key items since the last board meeting. So we don't have that definitive answer, but I think it's probably safe to say that over time, it's just been the revenue of Measure I staying flat as it's intended to be as a flat parcel tax, and all the other cost increases for programs exceeding the measure, which oftentimes happens for parcel tax measures. But staff will continue to note the request and go back and try and have that information gathered.
Yeah, and I wanted to say one other thing. It's heartbreaking to look at that slide and to see, especially we know that our kids are still suffering after the pandemic, that there's still a lot of mental health needs that our students have. And seeing, you know, the counselors that we hired with COVID money, which was an important thing for us to do, the state hasn't continued that funding. It goes. And so how it's horrible to see those positions and know that we're losing the funding that supported them. And, you know, looking at the state budget, I would love to just be able to go to our legislators and say, hey, the need for these positions is still there, and we need you to continue this funding. But with the budget, the state of California's budget, I don't know that that's going to be fruitful, but I'm going to continue to do that. And I think if we have community members contacting our legislators, I mean, it never hurts to have them listen to us as they are struggling with what to do with the state budget. But, you know, I don't want to see us lose any of those positions, but I don't see how we get around it unless the state decides to continue the funding that is they're pulling now.
Yeah, and I think Trustee Jones, you bring up a really important point. And historically, let's just say pre-pandemic, I think most school district leaders, most trustees across the state generally lived by kind of the old adage or the golden rule of when we have one-time dollars, we don't invest them in ongoing costs. But the amount of money that we received as a pandemic response, rightfully so, because the needs were so immense, kind of unofficially broke those rules, not just for Fremont, but for almost every district, because we got these large sums of money that weren't just 1 year. We knew they were, 2 to 4 years roughly. And they were so significant that it made sense to invest in support for kids. And that is kind of the pain point that I think Fremont and many other districts are facing right now, which is, this is the challenge of using one-time dollars for program and people because it's not sustainable. And that is the advocacy I think you're describing, Trustee Jones, is we've seen the fact that almost every district invested these one-time dollars in ongoing costs because there was no arguing the need for students. And what we've seen as people in the field is that need is still ever present. 2, 3, however you want to mark the years post-pandemic, the need is immense, and it continues with our youngest students and our oldest students who had those really formative years where they weren't in school and the pandemic impacted people very differently. So it is true, definitely an existing need that is in need of ongoing funding. Rocio.
Thank you, Mr. CJ, and thank you, Director Alcala, for the presentation. I had a question regarding the slide about the Community School Partnership Program, because you say in the presentation that it's one-time funds that expire at the end of the year, which is this year. And for what I understand, is several budgets that have been added in phase 1, phase 2. So it that have changed, because I was in another understanding that is something that is continuing now that is ending.
Yeah, the community schools grant is continuing and the funding will maintain for it. But Cabrillo, which was one of our schools that qualified for the community schools funding grant program, they elected to use a portion of that for a planning position. So they hired a classified staff member for 1 year to lead the work of planning. And that component of the grant was very short, very small, and very specific. And so we knew upon hiring that position that it would be a temporary position for 1 year. But the remaining funding to support the community schools grant is scheduled to remain.
Okay, and so far it's only Cabrillo, because I remember Ms. Larissa Linas told me that was another school that was considered to start with the program. And Freeman, what is the?
Yeah, right now Cabrillo is our only school that has qualified for the grant. We do have, I think, one other school that's considering applying, but many of our schools, if not most of our schools, don't actually qualify to even apply for the program.
Okay, thank you.
And just if I may, just a little bit update on the Community Schools Partnership Program. My team, we were able to work with the coordinator at Cabrillo recently. She submitted a new grant, so we're hoping, keep our fingers crossed that that grant gets approved. It will, if the funding gets approved and we receive those dollars, we can continue her position moving forward. So she understands that her position is grant funded and it's really based on if the funding continues. But that grant is currently been submitted, so hopefully it gets passed.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions from the group? Certainly would encourage people who are interested to follow along with our board meeting on the 17th. We'll be taking a little bit of a deeper dive into our budget, and it certainly is a complex process, but important information. Michelle.
Yes, I would just say that as a comment, that your slide 23 definitely is a kick to people that if they're thinking about possibly trying to extend the parcel tax, that it's kind of a this is kind of like the first shot across the bow, because I was getting not only calls from my people, but I was getting calls from the LMTs saying, do you know anything? What can you do? And all that type of stuff. And I was referring them back to CSEA. But certainly let people know that if they feel this strongly about it, that as much as I agree with Diane, we should not link these to a parcel tax where you have all your LMTs. We have 12 campus supervisors on there. Looking back, we have 6 high schools that's what they had on there, and we didn't have the staffing at the middle schools like we do now with campus supervisors. So we need to get that information out to the public. They want to keep this status quo, that they're going to have to come up with some money, and they're going to have to look at a parcel tax. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And, certainly parcel tax is something that we're looking at. As you may recall, we polled for that in late summer, and the initial poll results didn't show strong enough support for it yet. But hopefully in the near future, we'll see an increase in that polling, and not the same funding, but just as a reminder, we're also in works for a potential ballot measure in November for a general obligation bond to address our school facilities needs. So this is something that I think we need to continue to look at. We have a really, really engaged community, which is fantastic. In terms of our local revenue, we're on, as you know from this group, we're on nearly the very bottom of what we receive per student for LCFF. And despite the generous support of our community, our parcel tax levy for our community and our general obligation bond levy for our community also remains one of the lowest in all of Alameda County, meaning that many other school districts, that the taxpayers of those communities are paying a much higher tax bill specific to their school district for parcel taxes and or general obligation bonds. Now, our cost of living is different than many other communities in Alameda County as well. There's a lot of factors to consider, but certainly community support in ballot measures is one of the things that protects funding for school districts in the most meaningful way. So that is something that we need to consider. And Ms. Sandoval, as we're getting closer to the end of our time, if you're able to, on one of the screens, could you please remind me of our next budget task force meeting?
We're scheduled for April 15th.
Okay. And that is, I think, a day that we have a special meeting. So
It is.
I will check in with our business team and send this group an update on the viability of that meeting and if we need to move it. If we do need to move it, the likely next step would be to update this group after our budget deep dive with the board on the 17th, and then consider the timing between that and the governor's May revise, which will be pretty pivotal. Any other future topics this board would like us to explore in the next 2 months? Yokes.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to talk. I had already requested about Prop 28. If we have any documentation about the split of the funding for the FUSD schools, that will be great.
Yes, we do. And I apologize. I thought I sent that to you, and I must have it in my draft folder because I know I requested the data from Director Akala and he sent it to me. And I crossed it off my list of something I did. But if you haven't received it, it must be in my draft folder. So I'll get it to you by the end of the day. And I'm happy to share it with this group. It's a publicly available document that says how much money each school got from Prop 28. We've talked about Prop 28 a few times in these meetings. And in timing, just so you know, we actually just got the audit guide for Prop 28, I think a week or two ago, even though the legislation passed a year ago. So one of the challenges with how that was all done, but most of our schools are planning on expenditures, and I'm happy to share the amount that each school is receiving, remembering that these funds, unlike others that I've seen, don't come to the district first for the district to create a plan. They are site-specific dollars that go to school sites. So I'm happy to share what those numbers are.
Thank you.
All right. Well, as is the case with many budget conversations, I'm trying to count the number of big happy smiles. But I appreciate you being here and being engaged in the conversation. We will continue to advocate for the changes we think we need at the state level, and we will continue to problem solve for the action that we need to see at the local level. So thank you very much for your engagement. And Yokes, yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I had one last question. It's about the funding and the proposed cut to all the UCs and the CSU funding. How would that affect the FUSD students? What do you say? Like the acceptance rate? Like, is there going to be any change in the UCs in terms of local versus outside, like out of state admissions because of the funding to meet the deficit? Do we have any information about that?
Yeah, we don't necessarily get that information directly. We'd have to look more to the UC CSU system. Most of the information that comes to us from the state level is really about K-14, which means that most of the information we get stops at the community college level. And even for community colleges, I would say that 95% of the information we get on the budget is TK through 12. There's even a very small fraction that we get related to community colleges. So we don't necessarily have the information for the UC CSU impacts. I think probably the biggest thing that I see and follow in that is that I know the governor has talked about a statewide bond initiative for school facilities. And historically, those have pulled better across the state when they don't include the CSU UC system. So I just know that politically the governor is going to have to look at how the governor is going to navigate the fact that the UC CSU system has needs versus maybe the governor's desire to pass a statewide bond for facilities. And why I mentioned that, some people oftentimes say, well, hey, CJ, if there's a statewide bond, what does that mean for us in a local bond? And what I always hope to remind people is that in order to qualify for statewide bond money, you have to have matching dollars locally. So a statewide bond helps us if we pass a bond here, because we need to have matching money to qualify for that state money. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll see if I can't find any information on that, Yogs, and I'll include it if I can send it out. But don't really have that off the top of my head. Sorry.
No problem. Thanks.
All right, group. Well, I appreciate the input today, and we will adjourn just short of 5 o'clock. And we will be in touch soon about whether or not we're meeting on the 15th, given that we have a special meeting that day as well. So thank you very much for your participation and for being here and ready to engage. Have a great rest of your night.